I think the Israeli regime will attack Iran. If it doesn't, that is a big defeat for the regime. In any war between Iran and Israel, Israel will lose. Iran has many underground missile bases and drone bases with hundreds of thousands of missiles and hundreds of thousands of drones. The Iranians have said that if they strike Iran, we will strike them much harder.
What does it mean, much harder?
I think it will be much more severe than what we saw a few days ago.
Why Iran do that for the other states? You have no borderline with the Israel and the Palestinian.
Iran has been supporting Venezuela against the United States. Iran has no borders with Venezuela. Iran has been helping Cuba. I think the real question is, why is it that others are not doing anything? Why is it that everyone else is sitting aside and just simply watching?
Bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
The Minister of Defense or the Minister of Genocide, he said we're going to cut off electricity, water, food, fuel, and everything from Gaza. And they began bombing hospitals and everything. So it was obvious that they wanted to wipe out the Palestinian people and expel the remainder. And as long as this regime exists, we've seen over the last year that the West will allow it to do anything. They will support it until the last Palestinian is killed. They will support it until the last Lebanese child is killed. We've seen that.
Start talking with the 7th October attack of Hamas to the Israeli land. How do you evaluate the outcomes of that action? You know, some experts criticize Hamas because of, we are witnessing the humanitarian disaster. If you look at from the perspective of the resistance movement, is that a beginning of the disaster or the beginning of kind of long-term victory?
Well, first, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they carried out this attack in response to decades of oppression. The Israeli regime constantly attacked Gaza. They are taking more and more land from the West Bank. They're expelling people from their homes in Al-Quds or Jerusalem. If nothing is done, then the Israeli regime is going to eliminate the Palestinian people from what is left of the land that they are on. And one cannot blame the victims for the atrocities carried out by the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime, if it carries out genocide, we cannot say that since they are carrying out genocide, we shouldn't resist. The Algerian war for independence, the struggle for independence against the French, during that struggle, some say that up to 2 million people were massacred and murdered and killed by the French regime. But ultimately, through those sacrifices, they gained their independence. If one is to refrain from the struggle because the oppressor is going to kill them, then the oppressor will always remain in power. So I think what Hamas and its allies did was legitimate, and it also prevented these oil-rich dictatorships in the region from normalizing relations with the Israeli regime, which would have been very bad for the Palestinian people. We were on the verge of change in the region where these family dictatorships would normalize, and things would have been much more difficult.
The another part of this criticism, which is this attack give an opportunity to the corrupt Netanyahu regime, or inside the Israel policy, and the Netanyahu was in kind of tough position. What can you say?
Netanyahu is a corrupt person, but we shouldn't be naive. Israel is an ethno-supremacist regime. The liberals are not any better than Netanyahu. For example, the pilots who are slaughtering women and children every day. Most of the people who are being massacred in Lebanon and in Gaza are being slaughtered by pilots. These pilots are mostly from the liberal faction. If you recall, during the protests before October the 7th, many of these pilots were saying we're not going to serve because we are protesting against Netanyahu. So most of the murders are being carried out by people who are opposed to Netanyahu. There's no real difference between the different factions inside Israel. A racist regime believes that the Palestinian people are inferior, that they're subhuman. As they say themselves, they're Amalek. It doesn't matter who's the prime minister of the Israeli regime. In fact, I think that Netanyahu is probably worse for the regime than anyone else because he's a fool. And he does not care about the interests of the Israeli regime. He cares about the interests of Netanyahu. And I think that despite all the massacres, despite the Holocaust in Gaza and the genocidal attacks in Lebanon, Netanyahu is doing more than anyone else to bring about the destruction of the Israeli regime. I'm not saying that Israel is going to collapse tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, but we are in the dying years of the Israeli regime. What the axis of resistance is doing is destroying the regime or killing the regime through, as the Chinese say, a death by 1,000 cuts.
The question is, after the 7th October, we couldn't see from the beginning coordinated action of the, the resistance group, and Hezbollah waited and act after for a while, not at the same time. And Hamas did something with which its own desire, and we understand and kind of thing, and completely independently, maybe. And they have the political headquarters, and if you look at from the resistance perspective, this is the question. This divide section chance to overthrow the Israeli regime, is it realistic? Just we are talking about the oppressor have nuclear power and it has the support of the United States, and the other side, okay, brave and ready to sacrifice themselves, and humble people, but too much divided. Do you agree with that?
Actually, Hezbollah began fighting Israel on October the 8th, one day after Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the others carried out their attack, even though Hezbollah did not know about the attack beforehand. So they played a very heroic part in this battle over the last year, because they drew away half of the Israeli army away from Gaza so that they would have less troops to carry out the genocide. And we saw from the very beginning that Israel was hell-bent on carrying out a Holocaust. The Prime Minister was calling the Palestinians Amalek, and in biblical terms, that was a tribe that was completely wiped out, even their children and animals. The president said that there are no innocents in Gaza. That means the children are not innocent. The Minister of Defense, or the Minister of Genocide, he said we're going to cut off electricity, water, food, fuel, and everything from Gaza. And they began bombing hospitals and everything. So it was obvious that they wanted to wipe out the Palestinian people and expel the remainder. So Hezbollah heroically, and probably the greatest heroes of this whole war is Hezbollah, because they were fighting Israel alongside the border. They were putting themselves at risk. They gave hundreds of martyrs during the year, and now we see how important they were, because the Israelis are now trying to get revenge, and they're striking Lebanon harder than even Gaza today. On the other hand, you saw Ansarullah in the Red Sea. They began blocking shipping, and they've imposed a lot of punishment on the Israeli regime as well. The Iranians, as I think everyone knows, the sanctions that Iran has experienced for decades, it's all about Palestine. It has nothing to do with the nuclear program or human rights or animal rights or global warming or anything that the Americans want to use as an excuse to sanction Iran. It's all about Palestine. And so the Iranians have also continued to sacrifice in the military capabilities of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah and Ansarullah and the resistance in Iraq and Syria, all of them, these capabilities come from Iran. The Iranians have helped develop the tunnels and the weapon systems and the trainings across the board. So I think that from the very beginning, they were able to surround the Israelis and to put a lot of pressure on them. And this has made the Israeli regime increasingly desperate. They lost in Gaza. True, they've killed maybe hundreds of thousands of people, because the official numbers are not the real numbers. We know that maybe tens of thousands of people are still under the rubble. We know that many tens of thousands of people died of disease or cancer or other problems that since there was no medicine, there were no hospitals, no clean water, there was no food, so many people died. But that actually, I think, is the biggest failure of the Israeli regime, because the Israeli regime has exposed itself to the world as a barbaric and illegitimate regime. So they killed many people, but they also destroyed their own image, and the West has lost its credibility, and its image has been destroyed in the world because they supported the regime. So, but militarily, after a year, the Israelis have been unable to take Gaza, a dot on the map. Gaza is very small. Remember in 1982 when the Israeli regime invaded Lebanon, they reached the capital in 4 days, 5 days. Now, they've not been able to capture Gaza, and in the border in Lebanon, after a year, no progress, and now in the last couple of weeks when there's been very intensive fighting, they've made no progress in Lebanon either. So the world has changed. Israel has been defeated on all fronts, and that is why Netanyahu is so desperate to escalate the war. And that is why he's trying to draw in the Americans to fight on behalf of Israel.
There is another discussion in the Lebanon, after the Lebanon, its possible target of Israel, it could be Syria. Do you agree with that?
It is possible that the Israeli regime would attack Syria, but they already have too many problems. They have troops stuck on the border with Lebanon. They have troops stuck on the border with Gaza. And they have troops stuck in the West Bank because the resistance in the West Bank is growing. And that is also thanks to Syria, because Syria has been helping the resistance both in Lebanon and Gaza and the West Bank, or Iran through Syria. I don't think that the Israeli regime will succeed. It is possible that they could expand the war through Syria, but the resistance has also prepared itself for that possibility. I think that if the government in Turkey really wants to help the Palestinian people, if they're not willing to give weapons, and if they're not willing to end business with Israel, and if they're not willing to stop the cheap oil going to the Israeli regime, at least they could end the conflict in Idlib so that the Syrian government could focus more on the border with the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, and be able to defend Syria better against the Israeli regime. But I still think that the Israelis cannot attack Syria and win.
I ask this question because if you look at the map, resistance forces gives all the the strategic and the weapon or food or many things that from that way, from Iran, Iraq, and desert of Syria, there is a huge way, and they're coming from the mountain of Iran, and the between Beirut and the Damascus, there is an important way, and maybe it could be a military target of Israel. In this case, what kind of answer could given by the resistance forces against Israel?
Well, what I can say is that the dirty war in Syria that we saw from 2011, I think now when we look at what's happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, we better understand what the dirty war was about from the very beginning. In 2011, the United States and its allies in the region wanted to destroy Syria. They wanted to overthrow the government in order to break that bridge. They wanted to break the bridge for the resistance. because Iran's support to Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Syria, all of that is key to defeating the Israeli regime. And unfortunately, some of the countries in the region did a deal with the devil. And we now see that those very same countries that destroyed Syria, they're now destroying Gaza, and their partners in Syria are not helping Gaza. They're not doing anything. They're talking, but they're not doing anything. So you're correct, Syria is very important for the resistance. But I think that if the Israeli regime attempts to do this, they will not have enough troops, because they have so many troops engaged in Lebanon, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. But also, the resistance has lots of forces in Iraq, and of course, troops from Iran, and they would rush to the aid of the Syrians. So that would overextend the Israeli regime even further. And the United States and the West, they're really in no position to expand this war. The United States has more than enough trouble in Ukraine. It's a war that they're losing. The situation in Ukraine is very bad for NATO. And over the last few weeks, no one's been talking about Ukraine. But that doesn't mean the war is not continuing. It's continuing, and it's a very heavy, the battles are very heavy. So I don't think the Israeli regime has the capability to attack Syria and make progress, because the resistance is going to respond immediately. But also, other countries won't accept this. Syria has not attacked Israel. Israel bombs Syria every day. And I think we have to ask ourselves why. Those people who have been so opposed to Syria in the past, they should ask themselves, why isn't their country being bombed? Why is it Syria that's being bombed? Syria is being bombed because Syria is helping the Palestinian people, whereas others are not. But I don't believe that the Israeli regime can do that. I think that countries like Iran, like Russia, like China, won't accept an attack on the capital of Syria, on Damascus.
If you look at to the region from the little bit bigger angle, before the 5 decades ago, it was a conflict between the Arab states and Israel. But now, and after the unfortunate crashing of Syrian state structure, this conflict converted by Israel and the United States, kind of Israel and the groups fight. They are considered, this situation as a victory. In the Egypt, no, and Jordan, and if you look at the Gulf, beginning of that process, they were not attempt any action to the Israel. Baghdad collapsed, Syria collapsed, Lebanon collapsed, and isn't it a success of Israel?
In certain respects, it is a success. In the Persian Gulf region, no one is going to do anything for Palestine. Qatar at most is just going to have Al Jazeera television, which is not going to change anything. It provides some information, but wars are not won or lost because of a TV program. No other country is helping except for Iran, Yemen, and groups in Iraq and Lebanon, and the government in Syria. You're correct, and these constitute the axis of resistance. So the axis of resistance is a combination of governments and groups, and of course there's Palestine itself, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and the other smaller groups of resistance that exist across Palestine. So in a sense it is a success, but if we look at the achievements of the axis of resistance, they're much greater than the Arab governments, any achievements that the Arab governments ever had. In all the wars, the Israelis won. The first war that the Israelis lost was to Hezbollah. They had to retreat from Beirut after they invaded in 1982. That's when Hezbollah was created. It was created as a result of the occupation. They gradually expelled the regime, and finally in the year 2000, the regime left Lebanon. And of course, Hezbollah defeated the regime in 2006. And now we see that in the last year, the Israeli regime has failed. They've murdered people in Lebanon, they've murdered people in Gaza, they've murdered people in the West Bank, they've murdered people in Syria, in Yemen, and in Iran. But they haven't achieved anything on the ground. They have achieved nothing on the battlefield. So I think that the achievements of the axis of resistance are much greater than the achievements of those Arab governments.
What is the value of this struggle against Israel of Palestinian people or the resistance acts for Tehran? Is it just a regional tool for the diplomacy or for the having huge arms in the region, or what kind of purpose, if you look at from the Tehran's position, the end of the day?
I hear a lot of criticism of Iran in some places, and I think, to be very blunt, it usually comes from people who do nothing or people whose governments do nothing, and they want to diminish what Iran has done in order to justify their own inaction. The fact is that Iran has sacrificed a lot for Palestine. Iran has endured many years of maximum pressure sanctions because of Palestine. Iran has funded heavily the resistance in Palestine to defend itself and the axis of resistance to help the Palestinians. This has been very costly for the country. It doesn't come cheap, this policy. This policy goes back to the revolution itself.
Yeah.
The revolutionaries from before the revolution were criticizing the Shah for 3 foreign policy issues. Issues at home aside, but on foreign policy they were saying, 1, Iran is dependent on the United States. 2, Iran supports apartheid South Africa. And 3, Iran supports the Israeli regime and apartheid in Palestine. And that Iran should break off ties with these 2 apartheid regimes. And that is what Iran did on day 1 of the revolution. They closed the Israeli embassy, they closed the South African embassy, and they began supporting the resistance groups both in South Africa and in Palestine. What Iran is pursuing today is to bring about the end of the Israeli regime, just like in South Africa. Not to kill Jews. Without a doubt, Iran is against killing innocent people. Iran has Jews in the country. We have, according to the constitution, we have to have a Jewish Iranian in parliament. We have synagogues. We have kosher restaurants in Iran. So Iran is definitely not against Jews. What Iran is against is Zionism. It's against racism, and Iran believes that the whole of Palestine, not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the whole of the Palestine, Jews, Muslims, and Christians have equal rights. When South Africa, the apartheid system there collapsed, Iran established ties with South Africa and has very good ties with South Africa. And white South Africans continue to be in South Africa, and they are actually in the coalition that rules the country right now.
You know, there are many allegations to Iran. This attack could be, or it is, kind of a coordinated action, but not direct coordination, the indirect, maybe throughout Qatar to US, DC, and what is the source of this kind of allegations?
I think it comes from people who are doing nothing for the Palestinian people, who pretend to support the Palestinian people, and since they do nothing and Iran is making major sacrifices, they want to diminish what Iran does in order to justify themselves. They want to say that, no, in reality Iran is doing nothing so that people don't blame them. But it's very clear that Iran has lost hundreds of billions of dollars because of the sanctions, and Iran has spent many billions of dollars. The United States right now is constantly antagonizing Iran. We will probably have an Israeli attack on Iran very soon. There's no show here. This is decades of conflict over Palestine. I think those people who make these allegations should have some self-reflection and start thinking about changing their own behavior and acting in the real world and making moves in the real world to help the Palestinian people instead of grumbling and complaining and blaming others for the current situation.
If you look at from the realistic perspective, I wonder really you told Iran sacrificed too much. And yes, it's true. And I saw with my eyes in Syria and the region, and it's okay, and I can say nothing. But why Iran do that for the other states? And you are right, too much sacrificing. Maybe this is reason why you have some, economic problem because of the sanction. Why a state do that kind of action? You have no borderline with the Israel and the Palestinian. If you look at from the realistic perspective, how do you explain?
The same is true in South Africa. We had no border with South Africa, but Iran funded the ANC and other militant groups that were fighting against the South African regime. Iran has been supporting Venezuela against the United States. Iran has no borders with Venezuela. Iran has been helping Cuba. I think the real question is, why is it that others are not doing anything? Why is it that everyone else is sitting aside and just simply watching? I think it's a moral issue for Iranians. It's an ideological issue. It's a humanitarian issue. But also it is an issue of national security. The Israeli regime is a colony, and it is the last and most important Western colony. It is expansionist. And as long as this regime exists, we've seen over the last year that the West will allow it to do anything. They will support it until the last Palestinian is killed. They will support it until the last Lebanese child is killed. We've seen that. So when the West is willing to do anything for the Israeli regime, that means the West will never allow this region to have peace, stability, growth, and independence as long as there's an Israel. Because they want the region to be weak and broken so that this colony can remain and grow.
How do Western mind or Western decision-making process could see the situation reasonable?
The West is rapidly declining. They have too many problems. They have problems with Russia, they have problems with China, they have problems at home. The situation in Europe is not good. The situation in the United States is not good. There are deep divisions. And the will of the people of the region is against the Israeli regime. The West ultimately will have to accept reality. The weight of resistance is too heavy. We have to remember, again, how countries gained independence, whether it was Algeria or Southern Africa or India or anywhere else in the world. They all paid a heavy price. The West is willing to kill many people to preserve their empire. But the empire is falling. And I think that the support for the Palestinian people is growing, and the self-confidence of Hezbollah and the resistance is very high. And this, I think, is a turning point in history. The West has to ultimately, they will have to ultimately conclude that they cannot have a colony in West Asia.
Killing of leadership of Hezbollah, killing of Qasem Soleimani, killing of Hamas leaders in Tehran, and there were many killings we are witnessing just 2 or 3 years. And after that kind of suicides, can you say that the resistance power has enough human resources to revive itself?
You know, the West looks at us in an Orientalist way. They think that we are dependent upon individuals, that individuals are important in our society and not society itself. We are a sophisticated people. We have social structures. We have highly educated people in our part of the world. And in the resistance, the same is true. Hezbollah is a very strong organization, full of young, dedicated people who are highly educated. It has a sophisticated military structure and a sophisticated political structure. The same is true with all of the other resistance movements. The martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, or the martyrdom of Ismail Haniyeh, or the martyrdom of Haj Qasim Soleimani and others is painful to us, but it will change nothing. The Israeli regime will continue to murder our commanders. The Americans and the West will continue to conspire against our people and our resistance. But the resistance is far too powerful. They have created a young generation of people who are willing to sacrifice to end this colonization, to end this hegemony. And nothing is going to be able to stop that. We've seen that after the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah has become even more popular. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has become even more popular across the region and across the world. And the resistance over the last few days has inflicted heavy blows on the Israeli regime in southern Lebanon. They have not been able to advance even to take one town in Lebanon after this period of time, whereas, as you recall, in 1982, they took the whole southern half of Lebanon in days.
In the region, the land is wet, the weather is foggy, you know, and we are waiting the election of US. The Iranian system and decision-making process, how they consider US position.
It really doesn't make a difference to us whether it is Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Both of these leaders represent parties that are genocidal, that support the Holocaust in Gaza and support the genocidal attacks in Lebanon. Both of them support racism and ethno-supremacism in Palestine. Their parties are the same. They're two factions of the same political establishment. Donald Trump, when Iran struck back at American bases in northern Iraq after the martyrdom of Haj Qasim Soleimani, he said he's going to attack Iran, but he didn't, because he knew that Iran was very powerful. And Kamala Harris and Biden, they too know that the resistance is very powerful. If it wasn't powerful by now, they would have attacked the resistance many times. So for us, it doesn't matter. What is important is that the Palestinian people must be freed, and there's nothing that the Americans can do to stop it. The smart thing to do would be to find a solution like South Africa, to end the apartheid system, to end the racist system. But I think Palestine will see more bloodshed, sadly, before we finally get there. But the Israeli regime will not last. The economy is in tatters. No one is ever going to invest there again. The military has failed. Their intelligence gathering system throughout this year of war has not been effective. And if there is ultimately a ceasefire and the situation is like it is now, many in Israel will leave for good, because they'll recognize that this Israel is not the Israel that they thought it was, a very powerful regime that can defeat anyone.
This is my last question. Before the 7th October, in Istanbul, there was a delegation from the Hamas, and they gave a press conference in Taksim, and I was there. And just I forgot the member of the politic bureau of the Hamas. I asked very short question in Arabic. Which time we will see another war between the resistance and Israel? Just 1.5 months ago, you know, the 7th October. Of course, they told us nothing, but just we can feel the pressure on the air. Maybe after 1 hour later or 2 hours later, it could be an attack from Israel to Iran. We don't know. And just I'm wondering your prediction.
I think the Israeli regime will attack Iran. If it doesn't, that is a big defeat for the regime, because they've been talking about attacking Iran. But we have to remember that it's not Iran that escalated. The Israeli regime and the Americans carried out a cyber attack on Iran years ago against the nuclear program. We have to remember that the escalation has always begun with the Israeli regime. They carried out a cyber attack with Americans against the Iranian nuclear program. Then they assassinated Iranian scientists. One of those scientists was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran who was murdered in front of his wife. Then they murdered the deputy Minister of Defense. Then in Syria, in support of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and other groups, they bombed Iranian officers. So the provocations have always been from Israel. But more recently, they struck the Iranian embassy. After that, Iran retaliated. Then they murdered Ismail Haniyeh. When he was martyred in Tehran, Iran said it will retaliate. So Iran's retaliation that we saw a few days ago was a retaliation. It was begun by the other side. So if the Israeli regime strikes again, it is not retaliation, it is another provocation. And the Iranians have said that if they strike Iran, we will strike them much harder.
What does it mean, much harder?
I think it will be much more severe than what we saw a few days ago. So in any war between Iran and Israel, Israel will lose. And I think Netanyahu knows that. What Netanyahu wants is for the Americans to enter the war on his behalf. Because he's willing to sacrifice the Americans for himself. He's willing to sacrifice everything for himself. But the problem for the Americans is that if they enter any conflict with Iran, they will lose everything in Iraq, because the resistance will kick them out of Iraq and in Syria. But also their bases in the Persian Gulf will be destroyed. Iran has many underground missile bases and drone bases with hundreds of thousands of missiles and hundreds of thousands of drones. They were prepared for a war with the United States, especially after the Americans occupied Afghanistan and Iraq. But more importantly is that those countries that host American bases, those Arab dictatorships, they will be seen as hostile because they cannot pretend to be neutral when American bases are on their soil and Americans attack Iran. Their oil and gas installations will be destroyed. There will be no more oil and gas leaving this region, and that will lead to a global economic catastrophe, worse than what we saw in 1929. So I think the Americans are not that foolish. They may be, but I don't think they're that foolish. Iran has established a balance of terror with the United States. Just like during the Cold War, when there was a balance of terror between the Soviet Union and the United States, there's a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. And I think that is what will prevent the Americans from attacking. I could be wrong. The Americans could be more foolish than I think. But direct engagement with Iran, direct conflict with Iran, will be devastating for the world and for the United States in particular.
Can we say much harder days is coming for the region?
If the Israelis attack Iran, Iran will attack Israel. Iran will strike Israel very hard.
What is the limits this retaliation?
Whatever the Israelis do, Iran will do much worse. They'll hit them much harder. The Israeli regime will not win, especially since it's fighting a war in the north and the south and in the West Bank. If it's weakened, it will have much greater difficulty continuing the war. So Israel would be smart not to escalate. The Americans would be smart not to escalate, because if the Americans do that, as I said, that would bring about a global economic catastrophe. Tens of millions of people will move. Tens of millions of people will move, and that will also be an added catastrophe to the global economic meltdown. We could be entering a very, very horrible situation for the world, which, as I said, I find it difficult to imagine, because I think the Americans are not foolish enough not to see this. But Netanyahu is desperate. So we'll have to see how things play out.
Thank you.
Thank you.